IEC material. Before starting, I just want to remind everyone that we're going to record this session for people who could not join us, so they can access to it. Today we want to discuss about the IEC materials. As most of you know, the IEC materials are the messages that that we try to develop during the response to improve the impact of assistance, ensure durability of materials, and support long-term resilience and recovery. These messages are then communicated through information, education, and communication materials, which we shortly call them IEC materials. However, after this many years of working on these materials in the sector, we realized that we are really having a gap on understanding how actually we are doing this. How are we communicating with people in reality, and how we can improve the effectiveness and impact of messaging, and eventually how we can get better shelter programming. Today at this session, we want to discuss these questions. We start with a short introduction to the project, the Shelter Compendium project that was done by IOM under the PSB working group, Promoting Safe Building working group of the Global Shelter Cluster, and thanks to BHA funding. We introduced the project and briefly, and then we want to go through the learnings that we had during the work on this project. Then we're going to follow the discussion and the questions through a panel that we have, and eventually we have time for discussions and Q&A. So without further ado, I start with the Shelter Compendium. Shelter Compendium project started a year and a half ago. And to begin with, we realized that we need a definition of IEC materials, which was something that was missing in shelter sector. We used a definition from WHO that defined IECs as an approach. And this is very important that IECs are an approach. And what we have as a poster is an IEC material. And IECs should have a clear objective, a clear targeted audience, and the channels that we choose for communicating them should be also very well defined. Otherwise, it will not work. So I want to stress again here at the beginning of our conversations that IEC materials should be part of a communication process. And the poster on itself is not called an IEC, but it's just the material. So what did we do to start the work? This was a participative project. It involved more than 100 people in the sector. We collected the IEC materials from different people, from their hard drive here and there, and then we came up with around 30,000 files that was shared with us as IECs. But then we had to verify it with the same definitions that I mentioned, and we reduced the number to around 700 files. Then we did a data entry. We tagged the material under different tags. As you can see below, there is below in the slide, there is the taxonomy that we used. So we tagged the file data, the context that they were created on, and the content of the IEC material itself, based on, for example, what are the materials that are used in this IEC in the shelter works, or what is the theme of it? Is it about distribution? Is it about shelter construction? Is it about the settlements? And what's the theme? And this helped us to create a database. And our database, as I mentioned, has around 700 files right now. But then we designed the process to review these materials. We had 46 different reviewers with different backgrounds and knowledge of the context. We got in touch with country levels. We got in touch with experts on different teams, and we also designed the process that the materials could be reviewed by communities, by affected communities themselves, but we couldn't do much of that because of the COVID, as you know. So then we published in April an overview publication of Shelter Compendium, and the database is online in a website that you can see below the address iec.sheltercluster.org. This overview publication was launched in April and has 3 sections. It has an introduction that talks about the background of the work, the methodologies we use, and the learnings. Section A has the case studies and opinion pieces that we collected during the work on this project. And the Section B has the review. We selected initially 23 IECs for this publication that was reviewed on different categories, different criterias, and the rest are in the website. So what information you can, for example, find in the introduction? In the introduction, there are different analysis of the database. For example, you can see globally what are the themes, what are the type of responses that the IEC materials are created on and for which region. Or you can see, for example, on what was the type of context that the IEC material was created. For example, it was a conflict, it was a disaster, and then what are the different messages that it has. For example, something might be created in the context of conflict, but the IEC might be about flood response, as we know, which is one of the main problems in camps. So section A, as I mentioned, has different case studies on different important themes of IEC materials. We try to cover different important topics for developing IEC materials through case studies. Or for example, this diagram that shows that one of the most used IEC materials, which is on plastic sheeting, was actually came from a booklet in 1973. The drawing came from that and started copying, pasting, and still in 2020 we have the same message with different drawings in different IEC materials, which actually shows the way that sometimes we create the messages. We go back to the existing resources, we take the image, we adapt it to the context, and we have a new message other than reinventing the wheel. And section B, as I mentioned, it has different IEC materials, 23. We try to cover different themes of shelter and settlements. For example, you have some on fire safety, some on better construction or a temporary shelter, or even like CBI messaging. Then each IEC in this section on the left side, you have the reviews from the reviewers and the comments and feedbacks, and on the right side, you see the IEC material. On the top, the stars show the overall score that it got. The second box that I highlighted here is a brief background about how this IEC was created. And then we have some quotes from the reviewers and a small box that are communication tips, which are very interesting tips for creating IEC materials. And IECs are reviews based on different categories. For example, technical accuracy, technical complexity, graphic clarity, potential to cause harm, which is one of the very important ones. And these small communication tips boxes that I mentioned, we have a lot of them in the section B, so you can check different pages to learn more on very different topics. For example, one of the interesting ones that is keep being mentioned on construction is that we need to explain the consequence to people. We usually tell them this is the way that you have to build and this is not, but we never talk about consequences. And there's a very interesting report from CRS, which we are referencing here, that found that explaining the consequence is one of the main reasons for people to change their behavior. So when we were reviewing, for example, this IEC material, some of the reviewers mentioned that it can improve if we start explaining the consequences. Or we reviewed the famous IFRC Shelter Kit IEC with 30 reviewers, and then you can see the scores that it got. And it's very interesting to see that how much the opinion of our reviewers also vary. Some people find like it very correct and doesn't need any adaptation, but any changes in, but some people think that still there is room to improve. As I mentioned, the potential to cause harm, unintended harm, is one of the things that was very important for us. Some of the images can be misleading. Sometimes it's technically something that needs to be more discussed. Or yeah, as I mentioned, sometimes the image is misleading and we are not very careful with the graphics. So this is a very short introduction of the publication and the database. I hope that you go and check it on our website, which is like iec.sheltercluster.org. Today we want to discuss about the learnings that we had through this process. There are 7 main learnings that I can mention today. We started to share these learnings also in form of small short animated GIF files in social media, so it's more catchy and more understandable. I start with one of them. Okay. So I'm assuming that everyone can see the GIF. Let me know otherwise in chat if not. So this GIF actually explains how communication is a two-way street. There's a story that talks about putting an elephant in a dark room for people who don't know what the animal is and it's the first time seeing it, and different people go and touch different part of the elephant and they have different understanding of it. If someone who hasn't seen an elephant touch the truck, maybe it thinks that it's a rope or it's a snake or something else. Maybe the leg can be a pillar. So people have different understanding, and we cannot create something without them and think that later they will understand what we say. On many of these messages that we want to create comes in the communication because we have different perspective. We don't know much about the context and their understandings. The next one that I want to show is also one of the important messages. So as I mentioned at the beginning, IEC materials are not just a poster. It's just the top part of the anthill. There's a lot of different activities happening at the same time. There are different things involved. There is politics, coordination, the context, the available material, and there are different things coming together. At the end, you will see that you decide on the message and then you create an IEC material. And sometimes we forgot that. We take the material out of the context and we forgot all the things that was behind it and start questioning like why this was like this or why this was like that. It was very interesting, for example, the case study of Philippines. That how the process of developing the IEC material was kind of also helped shaping the policies, or was also the message was changed many times because of the existing policies. The third one that I want to show is this one. Some messages never change. This is taken from that graphic that I showed earlier, and it shows how this message is keep being repeated. And how we are actually creating the messages. But the thing to question is actually like after this many years and we're just copy pasting something, and how good we are with the rollout strategy, with communicating it. What is the impact? Okay. The fourth actually message that I want to talk about is we put a lot of weight on technical accuracy and we forgot about accessibility. If you check in the compendium, we have different case studies and different points that a communication channel was chosen by an agency and it didn't work because they didn't talk about accessibility and how different people are able to see, like different people from different ages, different genders, people with disability, etc., etc. The next message that I want to talk about is that the response evolves, but our IEC materials keep staying the same. It's very interesting to check the case study from Bangladesh, because in Cox's Bazar, they started with some IECs. They went again, checked how was the impact, if people, if the behaviors changed, if people know better right now. They created second, third, fourth, and even fifth version of the IEC material, and they're still doing that. But this is not the case in many places. And one of the important things which is also linked to this is that we often lack the step of evaluation and impact study. We found very few examples. There are, like, I can just count 3, maybe 4 examples that we saw that the impact was actually evaluated or the IEC was tested with the community. And this is one of the gaps that we have with the sector. And lastly, as I mentioned before, IEC materials are not a solution, and they should be contextualized and have a clear rollout strategy. Without a rollout strategy, you can never expect that a poster that you put or created and put on a wall, the message on the poster would be understood by the community. I would stop here and go back to the 3 questions that we had earlier. And I want to invite Alex Miller from BHA, if Alex is with us now. Okay. Okay, a little bit of change of plans. We move with our second panelist, Xavier. Yes.
Oops.
So we have Xavier today with us on the panel, and we want to discuss about the case study of Vanuatu. Thanks, Xavier.
Good afternoon. Do you hear me? It's okay?
Yes.
So, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are. I'm going to speak about the story about what happened in Vanuatu regarding IEC material. So basically, I'm going to tell you how we proceed in the long term on developing IEC material based on existing material, but also adapted to the local context. So basically, you see on these two pictures is 2 drawing we did collaboratively to see that shelter is not alone. It depends on the people. If you see on the right, there was a huge participation for different partners to see. We need to see children playing, and we see gardening, and we need to see disabled people on the picture, and we need to see women with a hammer. So it was collaborative. Next slide, Bushra. So for people who don't know Vanuatu, this is by far the most exposed country. If you look on the right, on the World Risk Index from the UN, you see that Vanuatu is far more exposed than any country in the world. And basically, the story started in 2015 with TCPAM. Next slide. So basically, in 2015, Vanuatu suffered the impact of Cyclone 5 category, PAM, and there was a big call for international assistance, and there was a call from the government to set up a shelter cluster, and IFRC, as a regional coordinator of the Pacific Shelter Cluster, responded to the call. Next slide. So basically, the shelter cluster was led by Public Works Department and IFRC, and I was supporting Public Works Department on behalf of IFRC. There was a clear understanding between partners that we needed to get solid messages, but to be sure that we will all use the same messages with the community, and it will not contradict traditional resilience mechanism and construction practice. So basically, you see on the center, Dick Abel, who was a shelter cluster coordinator at this time. He was the first Vanuatu architect. And so we discussed with him, with partners, and we agree to limit our messaging to 4 key messages. Why 4? Because he felt, and partners felt, it was sufficient enough, and not to put too much message to disrupt the communities. Based on this, there was also the decision to keep it on writing and on oral transmission. So the main the platform used was T-shirts for people to get the messages on the back, and there was one hour radio show that Dick and I animated on the radio. Interestingly, if you look on the bottom right, you see this is a BBS awareness session made in the communities by CARE, who was one of the main partners for recovery, and I was witnessing this session, and the old man on the back said to the young guy, "You see, we told you." So it was not injecting new knowledge, but reactivating some existing knowledge. And we had a slight impact evaluation because we did an evaluation of the shelter response, and I think 40 to 60% of the people also interviewed say that they hear some key messages on radio and it changed their way to rebuild. Next slide. So the shelter cluster was in Vanuatu the standing cluster for response and preparedness. And 3 years after, there was another response. The island that you see as a volcano who erupted. And you see on the big picture that people were in the other island evacuated and staying in this type of settlements. And as the shelter cluster coordinator changed for various reasons, and we decided as a cluster, what should we do? The scenario was quite multiple, meaning what could we do for the people who erected this shelter? We should help them to reinforce them. We should help also people if they are going to move back sometime on the island to strengthen their remaining shelters. And we have also the cyclone season coming. So next slide. So we decided to take the exact same key messages, but to put some to develop some graphic on it. So to do that, we have limited resources. So discussing with the shelter cluster coordinator was Nivan from Public Works Department, who was the lead, and partners on the ground. We decided to use as basis what was done in Philippines, but to review each of the graphics based on the local context. For example, you see that in the center, in the left, this is more or less the drawing that we developed in Philippines. But in the center, we included bamboo because bamboo was used by families evacuated, and we also explore the idea to connect timber and bushwood because that's critical. How people on this disaster, but more broadly in Vanuatu, are building. And you see, it's not on-off. It was something developed in Philippines that we apply. Is to say to make a gradation. It's the left is not good. But you should go to the right because like this you will have a more solid structure. It helps also the people depending on the resources and the capacity to choose the right setup. Next slide. And we also decided to discuss on how we want to disseminate these messages and these drawings. So we decided with all partners and donors active on this response, supporting also Vanuatu for preparedness, to say let's develop these 4 key messages on A4. This is what you see. It was a double-sided A4, plastified, was put on any distribution that an agency will do. For that, the household will get it with him and with explanation from the team. We did A2 posters on tarpaulin to be put on community places like the Nakamal, who is a social base where all the men are gathering by night. For them to pick some key messages and maybe discuss them. We also decided to use them in T-shirts for the coalition team. So it was you will see after a specific T-shirt for people from Public Works Department and Federation to be identified as leading the coordination. For partners, for all NGOs to have this T-shirt with them, and also for all shelter focal points who have been trained by agencies at community level. So it was also helping them to be identified and also to disseminate key messages. And we review the media and we say, should we do radio again? No, the people say, no, we should use Facebook. So we open a Facebook. Next slide. And people on the call like Robbie Dot know really well this situation because we did develop it together. So basically, this is the A2 posters, and this is a Facebook page, and this is a T-shirt. So on the right, you see the T-shirt for the coalition team, and on the right, on the left, and on the right, you see what does it mean for community members. On the back, he has the key messages. The Facebook page at the response time allow to set up these key messages, to put it to start for people to be for the population to be able to use it, but also to use it for the next response, to have a platform clearly identified to get the last key messages. For example, for TCR, they develop a new key messages about disposal of tarpaulin. So basically, that's it. Feel free to ask any question during this call or after. No worries for me. So for my key message would be, if you do IEC material, there's a lot of resources, but don't just inject what you take from another context. It's wrong. Engage discussion with partners, with communities, with cluster partners, and say what could be the right way, and transform it, revisit these key messages to be sure there will be no misconception of the key messages. That's it.
Thanks, Xavier. I think Alex is still not here with us. So we will move on to the questions and discussions after the presentations. I'm putting again here the 3 questions that we had, and we would like to hear also from others. What do you think? How we can actually improve the quality, effectiveness, and impact of messages? Yes, Xavier.
If I may raise a question or as a suggestion, I think we are really good at developing IEC material, but we, as you say, we are not good at evaluating its impact. So I think what would be good in continuation of this compendium is to go back to some of the context, to some of the affected population who has been receiving these key messages, and really evaluate the impact with them. We might have some surprise. I mean, on my experience, all the things we know about IEC, it's discussion with partners, with the key stakeholders. It might be evaluating if a municipality has a poster on his wall, things we did in Philippines, for example. But I don't know example really when we go back to community and say, do you know these key messages? Does it help you? How you think we should improve it? And maybe with different category in the population, meaning the skilled workers, the women, the disabled, or the children. I think that would be a great move forward to demystify some of our preconception. Over.
Yeah. Thanks. I totally agree. Now that we talked about it, I just want to mention about the evaluations that we know that they exist. One of them is about the IEC from Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. The other that we know is about evaluating actually the outreach of message, not exactly regarding technicalities, is from Ecuador, which was actually happened when the response was almost over. Same as the Philippine ones at the same point. And this is actually one of the things that we see as a gap, that evaluation of impact comes very late when we are not doing any more work in that context. And another one, which is actually testing the IEC material, not more on impact, but there's a good report from Shelterbox on testing the IEC materials that is also reflected in the compendium. Mariam.
Hi, thank you. So yes, there are indeed fantastic IEC materials for emergency shelter, transitional shelter construction, reconstruction, and retrofitting, Haiyan, and many examples. I wanted to ask, where are we beyond these construction tip sheets? Where are we in terms of materials accompanying rental market interventions? Have we developed more on that, or are we planning to do. And the second question is about behavior change. Definitely, these materials are a component of behavior change, and we're talking about measuring the impact. Is there also some work ongoing in terms of behavior change in a broader, with more components? Thank you. Over.
Thanks. I can answer to the first question. For the second one, I invite anyone in the audience if you have better information than me to answer. So for the first one, I want to share again my screen. If you check the website, the database, and if you, for example, filter in type of response. With HLP, for example, we have a few materials on HLP. Under rental, I think we had one or two, and we didn't find more materials. And HLP was actually on rental. Yeah, nothing on rental. They're one of the gaps that we realized about the type of responses. If I go back again to this chart that shows how many materials we have on each type of response that we can say, for example, for shelter. Yeah, probably they go under cross-cutting, and under cross-cutting, you see the number very high, but it doesn't mean actually that we have, for example, a lot on HLP or other categories. The most things, as you mentioned, on construction and settlement, and then material production. Very few on access to assistance, very few on debris management, or like safety of workers, very few on distributions even. For HLP, I think I can just count 4 or 5. Related to CBI, I can count 5 again. So yeah, so it actually shows us the gap on some themes. And if anyone wants to answer to the second question or knows some information. Yep. Patrick?
Mine is just a question, additional question, sorry. I'm just looking at the link for the IEC and all these files. Are the source files available? Because it can help a lot if, say, we would like to utilize some of them, or yeah, because I can see the old PDFs.
Yeah, so for some of them, when we created the files, for some of them we found the source, but not for all of them. So we decided to for now we keep the PDFs, but yeah, some of them we have the source files as well. If you need, you can just reach out and we see the database.
Thank you.
Thanks. Amy, are you with us? Do you want to talk a little bit about the evaluation that the testing that Shelterbox did?
Hi. Hi, sorry, yeah, I am here. Yeah, I think we did this a couple of years ago now, so I feel like we've probably moved on a little bit since then. But what we did was we had a response in Paraguay to some flooding, and we recognized that we had started to develop our own IEC materials to support sort of the specific aid items that we provide. And we wanted to sort of make it a bit more concise than having lots and lots of different pieces of paper. And we hadn't really got round to, although we consult with the affected communities prior, we weren't amazing at that. We weren't great. And we really wanted to, I wouldn't say it was an impact evaluation on the impact of them, but it was certainly testing the understanding of each of those IEC materials. And what we did was a series of focus groups about probably 2 weeks to 1 month after the sorry, I've just realized my camera isn't working, so I've tried to put it on, but apologies for that. Yeah, so about 2 weeks to 4 weeks after we had distributed our aid items and delivered our IEC materials, we conducted focus groups with various different demographics within the affected community, and we broke down the IEC materials. So many of our images were in boxes. So we first of all just allowed the groups to have some space to really feedback what they thought the images were and what they meant. And that really opened our eyes up to seeing actually there are so many different interpretations to what these boxes are saying. Obviously, we tried not to use too much language to make it a bit more accessible for everybody. And yeah, it was really interesting. So we incorporated a lot of the learning from those focus group sessions and were able to sort of amend and adapt our IEC materials for sort of future responses within that particular area. We found that there was some direct sort of context specific learning points just for that particular region of Paraguay, and also some sort of wider learning points that we could apply to sort of our organizational wide IEC materials as well. I don't know if you want me to go into any more detail about that, but
one of the things that was very interesting was about translation. When I was reading the report, that some terminologies didn't work on translation, and that was one of the things that that was tested. I think it's very important also to mention it, that when sometimes we translate the IEC materials, it's not just about the context, but also the language that creates some misunderstandings.
Absolutely, yeah. I think one really good point or one good example of why that was so important for us was we were very much using sort of a general sort of Spanish translation for the wording, for some of the wording, for the little wording that we did have on the IEC materials. And one example around the mosquito net that we were using, we described that it had insecticide on it, and that people should be wary of this, and it can be sort of quite toxic if it goes onto the skin. Now we were able to translate that into Spanish fine, but that then from reading it from the local context, the local dialect within the affected community, it actually translated to sort of it being quite a harsh poison, which put the affected community off from using it. So we then had to change our messaging to ensure that that local dialect was encompassed into our IEC material. So like I said, we wouldn't necessarily use that IEC material outside of that community again, because it was a very small dialect. But for that instance, it was, and it wasn't just the mosquito nets. I think there were a couple of other things around sort of the use of solar lights, and the fact instead of it being flame resistant, it actually translated in that dialect to saying you could set it on fire, which is, a huge thing that we really needed to really have looked. And I suppose if our consultation process at the beginning had been a bit more thorough, we could have picked it up then. But I think, at least we did do that testing and pick that up, and we were able to then to adapt the IEC materials, and also send out sort of verbal messages amongst the affected community. So, that testing really did sort of change the scope of the use of our aid items. The use of mosquito nets was rapidly increased after we'd done that testing and made sure that that local dialect had been taken into consideration.
Oh, thanks a lot, Amy. So I just want to mention again that this is one of the projects that is already going on the IEC materials, and we worked on the existing IEC materials, and we wanted to understand like what we did so far on them. But there is another project that PSB working group is doing, and it's a protocol of creating new IEC materials, and it suggests different steps. And right now they are developing different tools that can assist some of these steps. You can find it on the Global Shelter Cluster website under that working group, which is very interesting and useful if you want to create new IEC materials. However, one of the steps in creating new IEC materials, as they also mentioned, is going back to the existing ones. And as we see the way that we do that. About the question about educational facilities for community and the use of IEC materials, if I understood it right, the question is about how we can make sure that the community is also understanding the use of IEC. And then it comes back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that it's not a poster, it should have a communication strategy. And part of that strategy is how you spread the message, you gather the community, you explain it to them. I did a testing in chat, and we asked people if they understand the fire safety IEC material, and no one could explain it to us. However, then when we started describing to them, we went like picture image by image, we discussed it, and later on people could explain it to each other. So that's what we are mentioning, that it's not a poster, it should have a clear communication strategy. Xavier, yeah, please.
You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Okay, now it's okay now. Great. No, so what I would say, if the question was referring to what I was saying about Vanuatu, is part of the response on by evacuation by one partner who was CARE in this regard, with in collaboration with Vanuatu Red Cross. There was a structure built in the village, model structure, who was just building traditional structure in new way, and the partner used all the IEC material to be part of a women's for shelter workshop, for example, when women from community were explained the IEC material, were supporting their understanding on the exchange of information. Is a two-way discussion, but I mean this material should not be seen as alone, should be really seen on the different declination that you could do with this messaging. I said Intisipime was just wording, but the partners and committee thought we should go further. But for example, the response ARPA for TC Harold in Ponto Coast Island, if I'm not wrong, the chief of the island said, no, we don't use this drawing, it's too complex for us. So again, it's not only facilities, it's not a poster, it's a real communication between all stakeholders concerned by the approach. The IEC, as you say, is an approach, is not a poster, I would say. Over.
Thanks. Sorry, I'm not seeing. Is there any other hand? Okay. Yeah, I think also there was another interesting point that another interesting case study, I would say, that was about Philippines and about the messages that they selected. And when we were discussing with the people who were involved, for example, they said that it's actually, it's also important, it was important for them what was the first message that they share, because usually we go with the first message as what is the location, where you should build your shelter or you should not. But as we know that people sometimes don't have much choice because that's their land, or they cannot go somewhere else easily. And when we start with that message, and then sometimes people lose the trust in reading the other messages. And that was one of the things that they mentioned, that they even discussed what message comes first and what doesn't come first. Or the other thing is about a study that was done in Nepal, because, for example, they realized that men and women trust different source of information. So even the source of information, where the information is come from, is different and have different impacts. Or in the study in Ecuador, for example, showed that though they were thinking that this peer-to-peer learning would happen, people who were not actually present during the trainings, after some months, they couldn't pick up the messages and explain. Though the people who could, they were mainly those that they were participated in the trainings themselves. However, for example, another study from Philippines showed that the opposite, that some people who were not even part of training, by looking at what the neighbor is building, they could learn some of the techniques. So it varies very much on the context, and that's why it's very much suggested to do the consultation with the community and do this as a part of a communication strategy, and not just go on with the materials. I'll stop here if Do we have any questions or any other opinions? Otherwise, we end this session to be on time. Okay. Xavier, I think there's a question for you.
I would say that I, to be frank and honest, I don't know, but it was a response with no real reconstruction. It was the island was evacuated because of the ashfall and things, but there was no so much damage. So I would not say that for when we developed this IEC material and the partners implemented, there was no real reconstruction needs from the people. It was more preparedness, reinforcement of shelter where they were when they were displaced, and also preparedness to the next cyclone season and how to reinforce their shelter before the cyclone is coming. So on this, I don't really know.
Thanks. Sayed Idris. You have your hands on.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. I'm Sayed Idris from the Afghan Red Crescent Society. And my question was exactly on, before my question, I have a comment. If we think or focus more on the community-based shelter programs and to be more contextualized in terms of considering the gender and diversity and the cultural issues of the communities. Specifically, if I go to this point, for example, in Afghanistan, we we don't work more for our shelter through the ARCS, but we only work in emergency shelter. So how can we make the programs, the sheltering programs, more contextualized to cover all the regions or the activity countries, because the programs are differing from country to country. We are in a conflict zone, in a conflict country, and most of our IDPs are conflict affected people. So how can we consider all the aspects of the Afghan community, for example, as it is a cultural country, and we have different social aspects in our country. How can we achieve a good program to be focused on and to cover all the aspects of our social angles and our social community? This is my question, because if we go through the shelter, so we have to consider all the types of, the diversity and the gender and the woman role in sheltering, and the marginalized people who are available in the country and might be in the other countries as well, the same.
Thank you. Can this, Basha, you have just very quickly 30 seconds to respond, and then the conversation can continue offline because we need to close this session to start the next one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so I just quickly respond that these questions also came up for us when we were working on Compendium. You can see it's the B20 IEC that we reviewed. It's actually from Pakistan. Even the way that the graphics are there, there are lots of comments about the potential harm that it can cause on that IEC specifically, and what is the message that we are conveying, and how it's not very much sometimes according to context if you take it from one location and put it somewhere else. Also, I wanted to let you know that there are some boxes in the communication tips that talk specifically about gender and culture, and how it's important in selecting the channel and the graphics, and also the message itself on those things. And just send me an email if you want to continue the discussion. I just put the email address also here in the chat. Thanks.
right,
Great,
thank you,
thank you very much.
everybody. So in 10 minutes, there's the closing session of the Global Shelter Cluster meeting. So you're all invited. So see you in about 10 minutes time to end our annual meeting for this year. Thank you, Basha, for this very interesting presentation.